Welcome back to Previously Prohibited. I'm Jenin here with my co-host Melissa Whitty, and we have a wonderful guest here today, Scott Horton, the director of the Libertarian Institute and editorial director of antiwar.com. Whenever I talk to libertarians who are pro-Palestine and understand the Palestinians' grievances and their perspective, they always say that they were influenced by Scott Horton, so I'm extremely excited to welcome him today. But first, Melissa, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, guys. If you could, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. We're so excited to have Scott with us. I was really nervous because he literally knows everything about the anti-war movement, everything you need to know about America's terrible foreign policy for the last 60, 70, 80 years now. And he is just so articulate and so thoughtful in the way that he's able to present the information and why the policies are wrong in a way that people can absorb and really learn from it. And so I think that you are probably have motivated countless people into coming to our side, to being anti-war, into recognizing why these policies are not just wrong, you know, from a humanitarian standpoint, but they're also really bad for the U.S. just on a purely kind of selfish level, really. I don't want to say selfish, but, you know, it's just not good for us. And so we're so excited to have you here.
Well, thank you both very much for having me. Happy to be here with you.
Absolutely. So you have a new book out, correct?
Yes, ma'am. You see it behind me there. Provoked: How Washington Started the New Cold War with Russia and the Catastrophe in Ukraine.
And so can you give us a 30,000 foot? I know it's pretty complex, and I'm sure everybody asks you for this. Well,
I mean, obviously, everything in the world is all Bill Clinton's fault, and this is our current Cold War with Russia is no exception. The book actually is divided in chapters just by presidents, and I start with H.W. Bush at the end of the last Cold War, and really kind of blame him for kicking off the new one right away. And then Clinton, Bush, Obama, Trump, and Biden have all played their parts in the thing. Overall, the story is NATO expansion, the Balkan Wars and shock therapy at Russia's expense, tearing up nuclear missile treaties and the anti-ballistic missile treaty, the color-coded revolutions against Russia's friends in their near abroad. There's, you know, all kinds of miscellaneous sections and chapters on all different outstanding issues, but broadly, you know, the question always had been, since the end of the last Cold War, what do we do about the NATO military alliance? And they decided, one, we're staying, because this is America's foothold in Europe. And two, we're expanding the thing. But they also all acknowledged all along that if we expand the military alliance, that is necessarily at Russia's expense. We're not erasing dividing lines in Europe, we're just moving it east, and we're making it obvious that the NATO alliance that was created to contain Soviet communism was now going to still be involved in the policy of what they called neo-containment of still Russia, if not the Soviet Union. And so, in other words, instead of having any kind of new world order, as Bush Sr. promised, not that that would have been a good thing, but the point is they kept the old world order. They kept the containment policy against Russia, and they kept up the, you know, the entire containment and Cold War policy against them. And including, you know, they were happy to back bin Ladenite terrorists in Bosnia, Kosovo, and Chechnya, as long as it was at the expense of the Russians or their friends, the Serbs. And then, you know, with the color-coded revolutions, that includes two different overthrows of the government of Ukraine, twice in 10 years, the Orange Revolution of 2004, and then the Maidan Revolution of 2014. In fact, George Soros had helped rig the election of 1994 for Leonid Kuchma before that. At least according to him. But then, of course, even though Donald Trump in his first term wanted to normalize relations with Russia and try to bring them back toward the West, he was framed for treason. And I don't know exactly what all your audience knows about that, but I'm here to tell you it was 100% fake, the Russiagate thing. The CIA and the FBI started it. The Democrats only kind of glommed on to the plot later to help embellish the thing, try to create predicates for FBI investigations and so forth, just to keep it all going. But,
and what was the motivation for that, in your opinion?
Well, in the first place, it was because Trump was supposed to be the jabroni. He was supposed to be the fall guy. There was one of the things that was leaked that had nothing to do with Russia, but it was leaked, and it showed in the Podesta emails where they had what they called the Pied Piper strategy. And this was where the Clinton campaign asked their friends in the media to support Donald Trump. Him and Ted Cruz and Ben Carson, they were seen as the wingers. The way it typically works in American politics is, in the primary, you run to the right or to the left, if you're a Republican or a Democrat, and then you run as a more moderate type in the general election to try to get the swing voters in the fall, right? And so the idea is if the parties are smart, they'll nominate the moderate. He's going to have the best chance of winning the swing voters in the fall, right? And so the idea was if we nominate a winger like Donald Trump, then he'll be the easiest to beat. But the problem was is Donald Trump is an outlier in a lot of ways, and he obviously, and they should have known better, he had the ability to recruit what are called Reagan Democrats, meaning union workers, factory workers who culturally are pretty conservative, but usually they just vote for their union and they're, bought and paid for Democrats. But with Donald Trump, he's the kind of guy like Ronald Reagan who could bring Democrats to cross the aisle and to support him, which is exactly what he did and exactly how he won. And but so you can tell if you go back, people would complain. Bernie Sanders is doing a rally with 3,000 people or 4,000 people, and there's no coverage of it. But Donald Trump is an hour and a half late to a speech, and CNN is just showing an hour and a half of his empty podium sitting there with the big Trump brand on it, just waiting for him to come. They treated him like he was the biggest deal in the world until it was about 3 weeks before the nominating convention. And then it was clear that he's going to have this thing locked up, and there's nothing the Republicans can do about it either. And once that was clear, immediately they just turned 180 degrees and launched their full-scale scorched earth campaign against Trump, how he was the worst person in the world, and how, they were essentially cheating, trying to rig the thing for Hillary Clinton. And so as part of that, John Brennan really got the Russiagate plot started in the end of 2015, where he asked the other of the so-called Five Eyes of the Anglosphere Empire to work together to come up with ways to come up with predicates, essentially, to investigate Trump and to have their informants bump, as they called it, into Trump campaign officials and try to get something on anyone. And this is the origin, for example, of the framing of George Papadopoulos, where a British intelligence agent, not a Russian one, a British intelligence agent, tried to plant on him the information that the Russians are going to leak something that hurts Hillary Clinton. And it didn't even really work, but essentially they rigged it close enough so that once the leak of the DNC hack came out, they were able to kind of retcon it, as they say when they do bad movie sequels and they kind of change things. They kind of retconned it to make it fit, to make it seem like Papadopoulos had known about this DNC hack and leak before it had hit. Right. And so he must have had secret information from this secret Russian spy, who of course was no such thing at all. The guy's name was Misfoot, and he was a British spy, not a Russian one. The whole thing was to try to create a predicate to launch the investigation. And so then once they got the thing going, the Democrats also then logged on, glommed onto the thing after the hack and leak of their records. And we still don't know for sure who did it, but we know for a fact that our government has no connection to Russia whatsoever. They cannot show that the Russians had, as they put it, exfiltrated the documents from these servers. And what had happened was the Democrats just decided what we should do is we should pin this on Trump, and we should say that the Russians did it with him and helped him do it, and he did it with them, and that they're all colluding together to steal the election. And that'll be, by red baiting him, that'll be how we steal the election from him and make sure to rig it and win. But the problem is they didn't win. And I remember we all mocked this at the time in the summer of 2016. It's like, of all the people to pick to red bait, you pick America's most famous real estate tycoon, right?
Yeah.
Like the guy is the Golden Arches. He's Coca-Cola Classic. He's Donald freaking Trump. You're telling me he's a secret agent of the Kremlin? It was just so stupid. It couldn't possibly stick. And it didn't stick. It didn't until after he was inaugurated. And then they kept pushing it. And then they came up with this Steele dossier that tried to implicate, his campaign manager and his one of his advisors, Paul Manafort and Carter Page, with having connections to the Russians. And then they had the New York Times put out all these stories. Oh, Trump was meeting with top-level Russian intelligence officials and all this stuff to keep pushing the thing forward. And
so I want to ask you a question about the New York Times. So I have a lot of they don't watch the show, so I can say this. I have a lot of libtard relatives who just read the New York Times, and they're relatively intelligent individuals, but, you know, they have limited time. They think whatever the New York Times says is the truth. And so they all have Ukrainian flags hanging in their lawn, and they're convinced that, you know, Trump is a Russian agent and all that. What's the New York Times? Why does the New York Times do this? What's their reasoning or rationale?
Well, they essentially represent the centrist foreign policy establishment. And essentially the idea was, we're doing this, right? The FBI put out thousands of leaks. And, you know, what's important about the Times for people who don't read it and don't really, you know, pay that much attention is this is who the government talks to, right? So if you're the kind of person who has to read the news every day, you read the Post, the Times, the Journal, AP, and Reuters, and this is essentially not necessarily the truth, but it's what the establishment sources are telling the media to tell us. So if you want to be fully literate in that, that's what you read, right? Because that's who they leak to, that's who they talk to. And the New York Times especially has a very privileged position as the agenda-setting media in the country. And, you know, they had run some early articles kind of throwing cold water on this and saying some of this stuff doesn't seem to hold up. But then they went ahead and went for it later on anyway and published some articles that even we know now much later, including the one I just mentioned there. Top Trump officials met with Russian intelligence officials. That came out just after he was inaugurated. And we know now that the FBI themselves wrote in the margin that this is completely wrong. And even James Comey, the FBI director, testified in front of Congress that in the main it was not correct, is what he said. In other words, there was nothing to it. There was nothing to it at all. So anyway, I'm sorry, I don't want to dwell too long on this, but the point being is that even though Donald Trump, for all of his flaws and whatever your libtard relatives think about him and whatever, he is an American patriot in his own conception anyway. He's not a sellout to any foreign nation. And his interest in befriending Russia...
Are you sure? What about Israel?
Well, okay, separate question. Whether Israel's a separate nation from America might be another controversy here. But he certainly was no sellout to the Reds, or to the Russians, and who are no longer the Reds. But they prevented him from changing his policy. And the American policy, and by the way, and this is oftentimes misunderstood, the entire American foreign policy establishment agrees that the problem is China. They're the rising power, and so we have to deal with them. And so how do we deal with them? Well, one of the problems is they're friends with Russia. So one idea is we should be friends with Russia, and we should suck up to Russia, and we should try to focus on bringing them to the West and focusing on their role as part of European and Christian civilization with us, and keep them separate from China. And try to continue and accentuate that Russian-Soviet split, or Russian-Sino split that Nixon and Kissinger had exploited 50 years ago. There's another set of thinkers there who say, yeah, exactly, China's the problem, but Russia also is the problem. We don't want to be friends with them, and we don't want to move them west. What we want to do is we want to bog them down in an expensive fight in Eastern Europe and weaken them strategically so that they're no good to China anyway.
So why do you think they say that they're a threat? Is it a resource thing? I always wonder, like, when you say, like, they are, China is a threat, is it will come down to a battle over resources, and that's why they're a threat to us? Or, because they're not really into territorial expansion.
Right. And they buy their resources, right? They invest in political control to some degree, I guess, in Africa and stuff like that. But none of these are resources that America needs. America's a resource exporter, just like the Russians are in most areas. But it's a matter of just strategic control over the planet and trying to essentially limit any rising power or mid-rank power at all times, which I think is completely crazy, right? Like the entire policy... Was the policy to save communism? Because it seems like that's what they actually did for all those decades, was actually prop communism up. Maybe that was deliberate because they never stopped complaining about defeating communism. Now, the first thing they did was go to Russia and try to prevent them from gaining from the abandoning of Marxism and the adopting of a capitalist economy by rigging the thing for gangsters and through corruption so badly that they really kept the Russian economy from being stabilized for a solid decade after the fall of the Soviet Union. And then in China, where you had Mao Zedong starve 40 million people to death, trying to abolish prices and money and subjective value. Oh, that didn't work. And then coming up from that, it was the Americans wanted them to. The Americans, as I just mentioned, 50 years ago, they made friends with Mao Zedong. Richard Nixon went over there and shook hands with the guy and made an informal treaty with them to break them off from their alliance with the Soviet Union. But then they sent Milton Friedman to teach them about property rights and subjective theory of prices and why markets work and why communism is stupid. And so it took them a while. They didn't really get going on their real serious market reforms and all that until the very early 1990s. It's kind of in name only in the 80s, but they really started growing their capitalist economy in the 90s. Well, isn't that what we wanted? Do we prefer 40 million more Chinese starved to death by a Marxist regime? Or we're happy now that these people's standard of living has been increased by 100 million% since the bad old days, and that they're part of the global economy now. But the problem is, the people who run our government, they're not free market economists, and they don't think like free market economists. They're statists and imperialists, and so that's how they see the world. So there's a great... an important speech by George Friedman, the director of Stratfor, the kind of private CIA consulting group that they give like intelligence briefings to big business and stuff. And he gave this speech where he explains, he goes, if Russia's doing better, we hit them. And if China makes a gain, we hit them. If Iran looks at us funny, we hit them. If anybody does anything, we hit them, we hit them, we hit them. We do whatever we can to keep them off balance, to keep them spending money, to make them paranoid, to make them overcommit to their counterintelligence capability, and every other thing that we can do to keep them off balance. What? Forever? To maintain American dominance, even though it's our policy that said it's time for the rest of the world to get wealthy like us. Well, with that wealth comes power and the ability to resist American edicts, but then we refuse to accept that part of it.
Yeah, it's almost like our entire policy was crafted by paranoid schizophrenics. But
or Democrats, as we call it.
Don't you think, though, that with the U.S.'s, it's like strategic ambiguity towards Taiwan, that it's always been in the make, right? The conflict, the normalization, the conflict was established at the same time, the simmering conflict, as the normalization with China, right? Because we officially stopped recognizing Taiwan as a separate entity, but we don't actually recognize it as part of China or as, either. And so it's just kind of floating out there, and we keep it. We don't, there's no official recognition. We don't have like an ambassador to it at all. And but again, we kind of just use it almost like Ukraine. Well, not almost, probably pretty much just like Ukraine, as this thing to poke the bear and piss them off, right? And it's been like that for 50 years now. Almost like you think these people are so sadistic that they're constantly planning the next war 30, 40, 50 years in advance so that there's always a conflict.
Well, I mean, in the case of Taiwan, essentially what happened was Nixon decided that we can't normalize relations with China if we don't recognize that Taiwan is part of China. And on the balance sheet, they said Taiwan is just not that important to us. It means everything to China. It doesn't really mean that much to us. So we don't want to just sacrifice them and turn them over. We don't want to invite Mao to go ahead and invade the place or recognize Beijing's sovereignty over the country literally. But they said, okay, yes, I mean, it is part of China. And see, at the time that they issued the ambiguity policy, America could kick China's ass. I mean, they had atom bombs. But other than that, America completely overmatched them with our naval power. And so it made sense from the American point of view to make that promise, or that sort of, not really that promise, but that sort of vague threat. And it was supposed to be kind of the best of both worlds. That, look, Taiwan, don't declare independence because we're not promising to back you up, right? But China, you shouldn't attack them. And we're not promising that we would defend them if you did, but we might. And we strongly urge you not to use violent force. So that policy has essentially worked for 50 years. But the thing is it always came with, and then we kick the can down the road and try to figure out a solution later that's a real solution. Now we have a situation where the Chinese Navy is plenty capable of keeping America away. And they can sink our ships before we can get within range of their fight there. So that game is really already up. They could lay siege to Taiwan right now, and we wouldn't really be able to do anything about it if they wanted to really call our bluff. So, but then the Chinese have a lot to lose if they do that. Right now, they have a pretty open relationship with Taiwan and tons of trade and all of that. I don't know exactly how effective the sanctions are on the microchips and all, but they have a ton to lose if they attack Taiwan in terms of their normal relations with the rest of the world. And they certainly are resource importers and heavily dependent, on sea traffic for their oil supplies and for every other thing. And so if they pick a fight with the rest of the world wants to climb onto a sanctions regime with America against them over Taiwan, or even the Western world does. That could cost them tremendously. And so they have big counter incentives from invading, but it's also true that we have American forces in the region that are basically set as tripwires, and they're these tiny islands that are right in the bay, right off the coast of China, within visual distance, right there. Taiwan's like 90 miles away, like Cuba. There are these tiny little islands. I forget. I'm sorry, the name of them. That are right within the bay there that have American Green Berets stationed on them right now. So if the thing kicks off, you'll have Americans killed immediately, and then that threatens to drag us right into the war. So the Americans think they're clever by doing this, right? They think this means, well, they wouldn't dare because we got Americans in the way. Unless they do dare, in which case we've got Americans in the way, right?
Right. Yeah, I saw, well, Pete Hegseth just yesterday said that America needed to start thinking about the possibility of going to war with China over Taiwan. And it just seemed like such an absolutely batshit insane thing for the Secretary of Defense to say, especially at a time when we are literally bombing the Houthis, threatening to bomb Iran, still involved in a proxy war in Ukraine. What is the motivation for all of this? What the hell is Trump doing? Because it seems like he's just running around kind of lighting little tiny fires here and there with no real strategy to actually deal with anything. Yeah. Other than apparently protesters on college campuses.
Yeah. The real threat.
I missed the Hegseth statement, so I don't know the full extent of what he was talking about there in the context there. I like to think, for now, just because who's got the time, that China's going to wait and not make this our problem for another little while here. I don't know. I think to just answer as briefly as possible on Ukraine, I think that Trump was sincere about wanting to end that war when he ran. And he does think that Joe Biden stole the election from him and that this would not have happened if he had won. And so now he wants to reverse that. I don't think he's in a very strong position to do so. The Russians are in a position of strength on the ground. The Americans really don't have anything more to threaten. They can pour in more weapons and add more sanctions, but Joe Biden already tried that. And there's really nothing America can do to make the difference for the Ukrainians other than outright intervene militarily, which we're not going to do. So the question really is now that they've begun, just how ambitious is Vladimir Putin? Does he want to seize Kharkiv and Odessa, and is he willing to make an absolute chump out of Donald Trump by making him fail to bring peace in order that he can prolong the war long enough to seize all that territory, all that southern coastline, all the way to Transnistria and all the rest? So,
do you think he wants Odessa?
Do I what?
Do you think he wants Odessa?
Maybe.
Yeah.
I think there are a lot of people in right-wing politics in Russia who think we came all this way. You're going to stop short now, right? Think Paul Wolfowitz. You got to go all the way to Baghdad and all of that. You know what I mean? They have their own Wolfowitzes there who are saying there's no way you're going to stop short of Kharkiv and Odessa after all we've been through. Now he could decide better than that. That would be a great place for him to compromise and show how reasonable he can be. But then again, that would mean stopping short of Transnistria, where they can declare sovereignty over that strip of land on the Moldovan-Ukrainian border there that they still control ever since the end of the Cold War. And Odessa is, after all, the most important port city there.
Yeah, that's it.
For Ukraine. It would deprive Ukraine of Odessa, and it would be a jewel back in Russia's crown there if they took it. So,
for those who don't know, Odessa is the most important port, as Scott said, in the Black Sea. It's where they export all of their grain out of, correct? To the rest of the world. So it is incredibly important. And with the loss of Crimea as well, which is never going back, it really kind of cuts off their access to the Black Sea and then trade to Turkey as well. So it would put Russia as a middleman between Ukraine and Turkey, which is, you know, a pretty big deal, obviously, access to all of Africa and the Middle East.
Yep. So I think it really depends on whether Putin is willing to play ball with Donald Trump or whether he's going to go ahead and push his advantage and continue to take the advantage that he has. So we'll see about that. As far as the other thing, I mean, this goes back to my flippant statement earlier that Donald Trump is not a foreign agent. That's not really right. I mean, as you guys immediately objected, he is an agent of the government of Israel, of the Likud party, and the Israeli agent Miriam Adelson, who married this casino mogul for his money, and now he's good and dead. She was controlling his fortune before that anyway. They've given now a total of $600 million to the Republican Party, half of that directly to Donald Trump's campaigns, the other half to the Republican Party overall in the country over just since 2016.
Do you think so Melissa and I were kind of hopeful, despite some of the evidence that should have made us think maybe we shouldn't be, when he initially, brokered a ceasefire deal and had Wyckoff go and Wickoff go and strong-arm Netanyahu. And we thought maybe his...
nice for the inauguration,
Yeah, I wanted to ask what your take was on that. Was that genuine and then something happened in the interim, or was that just a show?
No, it was always for decorum for Trump's inauguration. They never meant, as we can all tell, the Israeli side never meant to go to phase 2 of the negotiations. The policy always was, as Trump was parroting them. This is the policy that they want to somehow ... remove the Palestinian population from the Gaza Strip and replace them with Israeli Jews. And that's the plan. And they reiterated today. I just saw a thing today where I was on Dave DeCamp's show this morning. He read a quote from Benjamin Netanyahu from yesterday saying, "We absolutely welcome the Trump plan, and we will do the hard work to prepare and get everything ready to transfer the population of the Gaza Strip out of there voluntarily," he says, after decimating their entire society and trying to drive them out of there. And the only thing stopping them now is that no one will take them. And it's funny because you'll hear right-wingers, I swear to God, this lady Libby Emmons said to me, "Oh yeah, nobody wants them. That just proves what tears how horrible they are." And I wish I'd been on my game, because I know that is a direct quote from Adolf Hitler from the conference.
The 109 countries.
That's right. They're all terrorists and they're all traitors. Otherwise, how come nobody wants them? He said. And that's what these people say about the Palestinians. But of course, the answer is not that the Palestinians are filthy and have tuberculosis and are terrorists. The answer is that if all the Muslims are transferred out of there, then the Muslims, broadly speaking, lose control over the last of the holy sites, and especially the Al-Aqsa Mosque in East Jerusalem, not to mention the sites that are still important to them in the Gaza Strip. And so this is what it's about, and it's why the government, and of course for popular support reasons too, none of these Sunni Arab countries can work in a conspiracy with Israel to transfer these giant populations into their countries, or they're aiding and abetting this genocide, and their people will hold them accountable. Even in totalitarian dictatorship Egypt, we've seen what happens. If the people are mad enough, they can overthrow the dictator there. They did it in 2011. They can do it again. And in Jordan, of course, it's a very precarious situation. They can't take them. Just a couple of weeks ago, they were talking about moving all the Palestinians on buses to Syria to languish under the rule of the new al-Qaeda regime in Damascus there. So they have no ideas, and they have no gigantic broom to use to shoo all these people away with either, right? We just saw what happened when Israel bombed them for a year and 3/4. Nothing. They killed some Hamas guys. They killed 50,000 men, women, and children.
Probably more. I think we're both on the they probably killed more like a couple 100,000.
I wonder about that. I mean, the official toll is 50,000, and I think that includes conservative estimates of the lost bodies, too. Although I'm surprised by that. I would also think that it would be in the high tens of thousands by now. That, the Hawks always say that the Gaza Health Ministry embellishes and exaggerates. I don't think
the Hamas run Ministry of Health.
And look, it's true, and I document this in my book, that, in Bosnia, the Muslims would attack their own people and exaggerate war crimes against themselves all the time in order to try to justify American intervention on their behalf. But that doesn't mean that's what's happening here in Gaza. And America's not intervening on their behalf no matter what. They got no real motive to do anything like that. And the Israelis, openly boast about killing them all day. You look at antiwar.com right now, there's a story about how they massacred a bunch of healthcare workers.
Yeah.
And then they were missing and nobody knew what happened to them. And then the Israelis admitted, oh, yeah, that was us that killed them. And we thought they were bad guys, but it turned out that it was an ambulance and a fire truck and whatever, some guys from the Red Crescent. And they just blew them all away. And, this is just, it's like the Waco massacre every day, 2 or 3 times a day over there, over and over and over again. And then, so clearly the policy was, as far as the ceasefire, the policy was to make Trump look good when he came into office there. And then he's the one who gave them, he's the one who gave them the green light to go ahead and continue, even though everyone knows. I mean, it's all over the Israeli media. Even the New York Times admitted it, against interest, covering for their friends here. But that there's just no question that the Israelis broke the ceasefire. They were supposed to move to the phase 2 negotiations to get more hostages released. And first what happened was the American special envoy went over there and was trying to make a separate deal to get there's one still living American Israeli hostage there and some dead bodies of some Americans. And he was trying to make a deal to get those out. Well, the Israelis freaked out because, as they put it, this they fear would undermine American support for the rest of what they want to do there once America takes care of its direct interests there. And this guy, the special envoy, I'm sorry, I forget his name.
Adam Goldberg. Is it Goldberg?
No,
not Witkoff. That's not Witkoff.
Not Witkoff. No,
it was another guy. It was another guy.
It was the younger guy. Adam.
Yeah. He went on Israeli agent Jake Tapper's show on CNN and walked right into it and opened his big
He's
mouth.
like, oh, they're not that bad, guys. They don't have horns coming out of their heads.
Yeah, exactly. He made these insane, outrageous statements such as the Hamas guys are human beings and we can negotiate with them. And that America doesn't work for Israel. We have our own interests here. Well,
that was the real crime. that was where he messed up.
And then it was clear, and this is in the Israeli press, it wasn't even pro-Israeli agents in America. It was Israelis who got on the phone and got this guy fired. And got him removed right the hell out of there. I mean, you talk about, America first or Israel instead. There you have it. That's exactly, ought to be the lesson to you right there. What else do you need to know from there? And then, as they've said numerous times since then, and all the Israeli media reported, the Israelis broke the ceasefire. They kept bombing and bombing and bombing, and including they cut off all the humanitarian aid and everything that they had agreed to. And then they refused to even sit down for the phase 2 talks, and they just decided to start the war up again. They just started a massive new bombing campaign. There was no new attack by Hamas to even pretend to justify it. There was nothing that had happened. They just went ahead and went on. And by the way, I guess I might as well address, because I sort of brought up that Donald Trump had announced this plan that America somehow is going to take possession of Gaza, cleanse it of all the Palestinians, and rebuild the place into some kind of paradise, and then give it to the Israelis. Well, Witkoff kind of modified that a little bit in his another special emissary of Trump's over there to negotiate. In his interview on the Tucker Carlson show, he made it sound like, no, the Palestinians can stay, but they're going to have to give us total control of the Strip. We're going to completely rebuild the thing. And somehow, I don't know who came up with this crap, but I've heard them say this 3 or 4 times. So like somewhere they decided this, that what we're going to do is we're going to have like giant call centers there and giant like software service centers in the Gaza Strip somehow. And this is going to be our economic development plan for the Gaza Strip. And it's like, I don't know where they're getting this stuff from, like who came up with this or wrote it down. But this is like, sounds like maybe it was left over from Jared Kushner's deal of the century. from back in the first Trump term, which is you get nothing, but here's some money. You don't get citizenship and you don't get independence, but we'll give you a little bit of welfare, hopefully enough to keep your lips shut, kind of thing. So they keep talking like this. But the thing is, and this is the important part of it, right, is that Donald Trump doesn't know the first thing about it. He doesn't understand.
Oh, no,
And
yeah,
so,
that's...
Yeah, I mean, what it would really take to remove the Palestinians would either be a serious bombing campaign with B-52s, just carpet bombing the place with dumb bombs like Richard Nixon over North Vietnam, if you've ever seen that footage, where they're just pouring bombs out of the belly of B-52s, which they're not going to do that. Or low-yield nukes. And they're not going to do that.
Right.
And otherwise, what do you got? You got a magic wish, or you got, right, your imagination. Right? You're going to pull out some big broom and you're going to tell the Palestinians, shoo, and they're going to go ahead and pick up and leave. But that's not true.
Why do you think they won't do the first? So I think nukes they won't do because that could hurt Israel. But why wouldn't they carpet bomb? Because I'm not sure that there's anything they wouldn't do ethically.
Because it would take American B-52s to do it. The Israelis don't have B-52s.
But they kind of have control of our government.
That's true. I mean, the only answer is because it would be a bridge too far public relations-wise. Yeah. That's it. Because of the footage of what it looks like to pour bombs out of the belly of a
I feel like they might be like, we got away with this. Like, everyone's seen dead babies for 15 months.
You might be right.
Yeah. I think definitely so. I still, I don't know, maybe call it copium, call it what you want. I still think that Donald Trump is susceptible. He's not a hardened politician the way Joe Biden was. He's still, Joe Biden sat there and watched as about 48,000 people were massacred with his bombs that he delivered, every 12 hours on the hour for the first full year. And I've always thought that when the protesters started showing up at Trump's rallies, Trump's gatherings with, bloodstained signs calling him Genocide Don, that I don't think that he will handle that as well as
he'll just throw them in detention. That's his.
We'll see, and maybe that's what this is about is try to discourage that. What we're seeing now, but. Yeah, I don't know. It's fascinating because we see this. We saw him, he's going to open up the gates of hell. And obviously he didn't do that, but the Israelis did in the last couple of weeks. But now, he's talking about he's pivoted towards Iran. And from what I can tell, Iran is going to call his bluff. They are not backing down. Do you think he's serious?
Yeah, well, a couple of things there. First of all, he's clearly being told that, Iran is behind everything. So if we just take care of that, that'll take care of these other problems. And that's just not true. No. Hamas is going to fight on no matter what. And I don't even know the extent of Iranian support for them anymore. I know it's greatly diminished since the war in Syria 10, 15 years ago when Hamas took al-Qaeda's side, at least rhetorically in spirit, against Assad. And the Iranians were pissed about that and cut them off then. So if they're financing them some now, fine, but they're not bringing them weapons because they have no ability to. The place is under total siege and blockade. There's no pier for Iranian ships to pull up and offload a bunch of missiles or anything like that. So
it's all coming from Egypt, right? Which would be Sisi, right?
It's all light arms, right?
Right.
It's nothing severe. They call them rockets because they don't dare call them missiles because they're not missiles,
right. Yeah.
They're more like Katyusha rockets, So it's also not the case that Iran is behind the Houthis. Iran probably supports them to some degree, but the Houthis seized the capital city of Sana'a at the end of 2014 over Iran's best advice not to do so because they said it'll start a war with the Saudis. They're going to freak out and start bombing you, which is exactly what happened. Obama helped them do it. So the Houthis, as a Dutch analyst wrote years ago for Foreign Policy, he said the Houthis are not Hezbollah. In other words, Hezbollah basically is Iran's 51st state there in southern Lebanon. The Houthis in Yemen are not that. They're not even the same kind of Shiites. They're Zaidi Shiites, which is different from the Twelvers, and they have a whole different tradition about the end of the world and this and that. And so it's not like one chain of command. They want you to think, oh, Shiite means they all obey the Ayatollah, but it's not at all that simple.
Okay. They are quite, I mean, I'm not gonna lie, they're impressive. Their ability to sustain, I mean, they seem fearless.
Well,
I mean,
that's
it's
certainly the case. I mean, we bombed them. We helped UAE and Saudi bomb them for about 8 years.
Yeah.
And we accomplished nothing.
Yeah.
It killed a lot of innocent people, but the Houthi regime remains in control. It's kind of ridiculous. They call them Houthi rebels because they're still not the internationally recognized government of the country, as though that's what makes a government, as if the USA and its Western allies say so, when in fact they have ruled the capital city for 10 years in a row without stopping, which makes them the government of the damn country.
Right.
Sorry. They control like 2/3 of the population, the entire north and west of the country.
they have broad support, correct?
Yeah.
Yes.
And not that, I mean, and they do represent a minority tribe from the north, but I interviewed many times this Yemeni journalist named Nasser Arabi, and he says, sort of like when the Texans get elected to the presidency, and then somebody attacks New York City, well, we all support W. Bush, not we all, but Americans broadly support their president no matter who he's from or what faction he's from. He's the leader of the country, and we're under foreign attack now, so same thing. We're all Zaidi Shiites now. We're all Houthis now. If the Houthis are the government in Sana'a and they're the one defending us from attack by the foreign powers, that's the way the people see it, So, yes, war, as Randolph Bourne wrote, is the health of the state, unless you lose, in which case it's the health of the other guy's state. But as long as you're fighting, this is what makes a country into a nation, right? Is when they're fighting in a war together.
Right.
And so, yes, it's been absolutely nothing but positive for the Houthis in power there. Now, as far as Iran, we have a new president in Iran who was elected on trying to negotiate with the United States. He reappointed Javad Zarif, who was the foreign minister who made the deal with John Kerry in 2014, the one that Donald Trump tore up in 2018 at Netanyahu's behest, over lies that Netanyahu made up about Iran's nuclear program, by the way. And so then when Trump came in, the Ayatollah had said that, yes, we're open to talks if they want to talk. I mean, look, if you're the Ayatollah, what are you going to do with a problem like the United States of America, right? Like they're in a position of weakness and they know it. So, yeah, we're willing to talk with them. And Trump came in and said, yeah, we can talk with the Ayatollah. And, I don't know, I hear that they might not even want to make nuclear weapons, which is true, and which no president has admitted before, that they're actually not even seeking nuclear weapons. Now, it should be maybe easy to deal with them. So if he had kept that up, that would have been the way to get to the table. And instead what he did was he re-announced more sanctions. The crippling sanctions that he left Joe Biden and Joe Biden kept, he now has re-inherited from Biden and is implementing again and is making these severe threats. And the Ayatollah says, well, listen, I'm not giving in to threats. And then I forgot, Mohammed Sahimi wrote a great thing about this at Responsible Statecraft, where I'm trying to remember what they did with Zarif. I think the foreign minister went ahead and stepped down and said, I guess I'm not needed. And right, so we're taking a big step back. I think that was the way it happened. So, in other words, the Ayatollah is saying, look, you can't play hardball with me, dude. I'm not going to go along. You're not going to get me by threats.
But also haven't real quick.
Yeah.
Haven't the Chinese stopped abiding by our sanctions on Iran?
Oh, I don't know if the Chinese ever did.
I think I read something that somewhere along the line in 2021, basically the Chinese just said, you know what, we don't actually think Biden's going to do anything. And so they just started buying the oil. But of course, it's still on the black market, but they get a discount on it. And then, so
I don't know about that, but it would make sense for them to do because, why the hell not? All these sanctions were put on Iran to force them to negotiate. Well, then they did. And they entered into this nuclear deal, and we were supposed to lift all these sanctions against them. Obama was supposed to, and he never did. And then, of course, Trump never did. He only made them worse. And Joe Biden came in, and Joe Biden could have said, look, man, we had a deal, and this idiot Trump tore it up. Well, I'm going right back to the deal again. Well, he didn't do that. He kept the crippling sanctions and increased threats and told the Ayatollah, yeah, we want the same deal again plus a bunch of extra stuff. And not based on good faith, but based on more threats and stronger economic warfare. And so, and I mean, there were a lot of sunset provisions in there that say you promise not to do this or that until for another 5 years or for another 10 years. Well, if we'd been dealing with them in good faith, our side might have been able to say to the Ayatollah, hey, man, let's go ahead and get rid of those sunsets and make those parts of the treaty permanent. We could have modified it and improved it if we had taken the deal that we already had and used it as the basis of further negotiations in good faith. Instead, Donald Trump, again, subordinated his foreign policy to Benjamin Netanyahu, tore up the deal, and now he has no way to get back in it again while still saving face. And it's hilarious, actually, to hear him talk about, yeah, what we need to do is get a nuclear deal with Iran. We had a nuclear deal with Iran. And they were already members of the Non-Proliferation Treaty and already had a safeguards agreement with the IAEA and were under full inspection regime and had not been diverting nuclear material to any military purposes. So the JCPOA was just a double extra inspection regime and further restrictions on their program. It was and in exchange, they got money that Jimmy Carter stole from them back in 1979 returned.
Those pallets of cash you guys are always crying about, it was their money.
It was their money. And I hate giving John Kerry credit for anything. He's so horrible, but man, that was a pretty good deal he made there. Some sanctions relief, which means we stop waging economic war on them, and then the money we got to give them is money that we had stolen and kept.
I don't even think we gave him interest. It was just the money that we had frozen.
That was it. And so now the Ayatollah is saying, look, man, you can't threaten me. I'm not going to get back into a deal on the basis of threats. However, and DeCamp pointed this out in his article, it's on antiwar.com today about it, that he did, in a way, leave the door open for back-channel negotiations. I forgot exactly the words, but it was something like, hey, if you guys want to talk, you know, our guys are always here kind of thing. So if we want to do 2 tracks, we can do that. We can have secret talks in Oman while everybody talks tough in public on TV about it and acts like tough guys about it. If Trump really wants a deal, then he can have one. But if he wants to screw it up, march himself right into a conflict by making unwarranted threats, then he could do that too. Now, I don't know for sure if he knows the difference or not. I mean, if you guys go back to remember when he was threatening North Korea in his first year before, going fire and fury like the world has never seen and all this, I actually was not that upset about that because I could tell that what was going on was he was trying to just set up a dialing down of tension here. That was what it was. This was his first move on the board.
I feel like everything is different when it comes to Israel, though. I mean, I get accused of all kinds of things, but I mean, the degree of control they have over our government is just, I mean, it's the uniparty when it comes to Israel, and it's clear that they exert a massive amount of control. So anybody who even comes in having good intentions ends up doing Israel's bidding in the end. And so I don't necessarily think that anything can be applied in a different context or in that context.
Obama, it took every bit of Obama's political capital that he had to tell Netanyahu, I heard your objections, I'm going ahead anyway. Right? And he gave a speech to the American people where he said that. Listen.
And that was the end of his second term.
Yeah, we know what their opinion is, and thanks very much for letting us know, but we're going to go ahead because my job is the national interest of the United States, not Israel. And he was only able to do that, you know, in his second term. And then
at the last month of his second term. Yeah. So
well, that was in 2015,
right?
But
okay. Yeah. I thought it was like right before Trump took office, basically.
But, so there was this couple named Flint and Hillary Mann Leverett who had been CIA and National Security Council officials in the Clinton and W. Bush years. And they wrote a book called Going to Tehran. And it was about how Obama needed to get on a plane and go to Tehran and sit down with the Ayatollah and hammer out everything. Nixon goes to China style. Because they said if he does just a nuclear deal, the Israelis are going to end up figuring out how to undo it because we still have all of these other unresolved issues, such as our relationship with them in Iraq, their support for Hamas and Hezbollah, and whatever, down the line, oil business and the rest. So they said, what you need to do is you got to go to Tehran, and just normalize relations completely, end the Cold War with Iran altogether. And Obama didn't have the courage to do that, or maybe didn't have the political capital to do that. Donald Trump has the political capital to do that. And I don't, this is the flaw in right-wing populism. There's so much to like about it, especially its rejection of our centrist consensus that we've been languishing under here. I don't know what percent of the MAGA movement out in the country, never mind in the establishment, like in the halls of power, but out in the country, do people really understand this is the thing that he can do without Congress? Forget all this Doge and all this crap. That's nothing.
Right.
How about get on a plane, go to Tehran, go to Moscow, go to Pyongyang, go to Beijing. I would throw in Damascus, but, well, they already took care of that. But we could have peace right now. He could, in one big trip, he could go to Iran, Russia, China, North Korea, and be Trump the Great and say, look, I made deals. These conflicts are over. They just put out their new national security strategy, or pardon me, not national security strategy, but their annual threat assessment that they put out, usually in February. They put out in the end of last month here, or March here. And they say in there, China seeks to, I forgot the exact words, forgive me, but they seek to diminish the chances of conflict with the United States and other major powers. Yeah. They're not interested in fighting with us. Mm-hmm. They say that even about the dreaded Chinese. And this is something we saw Trump musing about this in his first days in power. He said, I want a new treaty where America, Russia, and China all cut our military defense budgets in half. And he said, I want a new grand nuclear treaty where America and Russia bring our nuclear forces down to the level where China is now. And then China stops where they are and stop trying to catch up with the two of us. And then maybe we can even get lower than that. So I'm not saying we got to take his word for that he is definitely determined to see that through and all that. But it goes to show that his attitude is not simply, and this would be what the rest of the Republican establishment would say, right, is that we have to switch from terrorism to major power competition. And what he's saying is, no, we don't have to do any of this. Or maybe saying we need to switch back to the war on terrorism. But that we don't need major power competition with Russia and China. That we could get along into a medium-term future here, into the nearest decades before us here, in a situation of cooperation with the major powers of the earth, where everybody's just an independent sovereign nation making money. And we actually have nothing to fight about at all. We don't have to build up and have a fight over China. We don't have to build up and have a fight over Eastern Europe. We don't have to have a build up and a fight over anything. We can cut our militaries, cut our nukes, and let the rest of stop hitting everyone. Just let everybody in the world get rich. What's the worst that could happen? And that's that potential policy, that truly America first, make America great again policy lays right before us. It's all he has to do is take it. And for all your liberal New York Times friends, if Barack Obama had done that, they'd have loved it.
Yeah.
Barack Obama had said, not only am I ending the war in Iraq, but I'm also ending the war in Afghanistan, and I'm also going to Tehran and going to Moscow and going to Beijing and going to Pyongyang and making peace with the rogue powers of the world. We would have all supported that, and they would have all supported that, because that would have been the right thing to do if only he had had the moral courage to do so. And in fact, that's why he was elected. It's the same reason. By the way, George W. Bush ran on peace in 2000, and Barack Obama ran on peace in 2008, and Donald Trump ran on peace in 2016. Joe Biden didn't bother in 2020 at all. He ran on war. But Donald Trump ran on peace again and won in 2022. So
don't you think, though, I of course 100% agree, but I think it was sometime right after the withdrawal from Afghanistan when I could already sense, the war drums beating for Ukraine and Russia. And I remember it almost like hit me like a ton of bricks that I felt so kind of dumb thinking that we could just turn the war spigot off, because we've got this industry, this huge industry that has been growing for 20 years. And you can't just turn it off. You have to actually slay that beast, right? And I think what it comes down to is that there is no one with the courage, Congress is like herding cats, right? Trying to get them to agree on anything other than war, apparently. And so getting them all to confront that and dismantle it piece by piece by piece, that's the part where I don't see it ever happening. So I think what Trump wanted to do with his whole Iron Dome thing was like, all right, I don't think I can take the beast apart, but let me see if I can just redirect it. We're just going to, build this really stupid thing for the U.S. So we're still going to spend all the money, but it's going to be here in the U.S. and we're not going to be, bombing the crap out of people around the world, which I guess is a step in the right direction, but it still doesn't actually address the problem, which is that we have this Goliath controlling our government.
And that is what it would take, it would take a president as strong as Trump to have the conviction, first of all, the knowledge and the decency and the conviction of Ron Paul, but with the strength of Donald Trump, and to give a big direct speech and maybe a bunch of them explaining that, listen, Ike Eisenhower was right about that whole military-industrial complex thing. And that's why we are, yes, embarking on a policy of turning Boeing into a civilian airliner company. Yeah. We're not going to let Boeing control us anymore. Instead, what did he do? He announced Boeing gets to make the new F-47 ridiculous sixth-generation waste of money. In my Afghanistan book, the last chapter begins with some quotes from Trump. And the first two quotes are, oh, the military-industrial complex, it's so corrupt. They love war. They're evil. Rah! Because he's so hyperbolic. Everything he says, is like, man, this is way better than anything Ike Eisenhower ever said, They drink blood. And the last quote, he says, we want Raytheon and Boeing and Northrop and Lockheed to be huge and successful and the greatest military-industrial firms that have ever lived and whatever. And that's why I signed this big bill today. So this is what you get with the guy. He says a lot of great things, but he says a lot of the wrong things and does a lot of the wrong things too. Yeah. And that's really the best we can get out of him. So yes, so back to the point then. If we can't end the Afghan war without starting one in Ukraine, then what happens if we stop the war in Ukraine? That means we got to triple what we're doing to the poor Palestinians, or it means we got to kick off a whole new conflict with China in the Pacific.
Or Iran.
Means that, look, we're just going to have to crucify some CEOs and let the rest of them know that we're not in the empire business anymore. And Donald Trump is not a globalist, right? He's not an internationalist, but he's certainly not a non-interventionist, right? He's Teddy Roosevelt, right? He's, speak loudly and carry a big stick. Only call it our national interest instead of selfless sacrifice on behalf of the poor Iraqis who needed democracy delivered to them at our expense, right? Instead, it's all cold, hard interests, poorly calculated. But that's what America first means to him. It doesn't mean defend America first. It means be a greedy, selfish, belligerent jerk and take what you want, which is actually not much different than the George W. Bush doctrine at the end of the day.
Right. Yeah. It's I don't know. It's a little depressing, to be quite honest with you.
Everything is extremely depressing.
Ron Paul ran for president, and everybody told him no.
I know. Trust me. I still have my Ron Paul T-shirts and buttons from 2012. I was such a believer.
I think that, especially in 2012, when Obama had no opposition at all, didn't it make sense for all the liberal Democrats in America who could, according to their state's laws, vote in a Republican primary? Didn't it make sense for them all to vote for Ron so that he would get the nomination? Because there's no way he could have beat Barack Obama at his height for re-election as the incumbent president, tall, dark, and handsome, and 30 years younger than Dr. Paul and all of that. There's no way that Ron would have beat him. But Ron would have fought with him, quote unquote, from the left on foreign policy the whole time. You said you were going to end the wars, but all you did was expand them. Well, we want an end to the wars. We want an end to the torture. We want an end to the Patriot Act. Let Barack Obama run against a Republican who talks like that. Because isn't that what you want? Isn't that the way to get the best Barack Obama that you can get out of him? And no, they didn't have that vision whatsoever to do that. You know, they're perfectly happy to have him run against Mitt Romney because he'll be the easiest to beat because he's such a weakling and whatever, you know. But it didn't have to be that way. It absolutely didn't. And it's, you know, the irony of ironies really that in '08 when Ron ran, he was a German stock Methodist Republican from Texas, just like W. Bush. He looked like Bush maybe stepped out of his cloning machine or the other way around, and he's older, but they're like cookie cutter the same if you don't know that the Bushes are actually like go back to the Mayflower or close and are, you know, the skull and bones and cousins of the Queen of England and all this American establishment waspy royalty, and Ron Paul is the son of a farmer, you know, totally different.
Right.
But from just the most superficial point of view, you could even mistake one of them for the other, even though Ron was the absolute polar opposite of W. Bush on every single thing of substance, whereas Barack Obama was the same as him on every single thing of substance. But superficially, he was from the other party and was 6 inches taller and had dark skin and a big smile and a younger generation and all of the things that on their surface made him seem to be the opposite of Bush. And so there it was. There you have it, America. You have the actual opposite who looks just like the son of a bitch you're replacing, or you have the exact same who looks like the exact opposite. And the Americans went for the superficial crap.
Well, that's not a surprise.
Yeah. You know, thinking about what you just said about, you know, going, Mitt Romney is such kind of a perfect caricature of a Republican, right? Because he's handsome and he's just filthy rich, and he was making, you know, what was it? It was at the time, I think it was $250,000 every single day from his investments. And he was so easy to hate if you're a leftist. So I would think, you know, just from a purely superficial point of view, that of course they wanted him to run against, they wanted Obama, their guy, to run against Mitt Romney, you know, because they actually just want to beat the crap out of the Republican that they hate. They don't necessarily want to make their candidate any better. And it's vice versa. Republicans do the same crap, you know. And so
what does that tell you about the Republican Party? That not only did they choose John McCain over Ron Paul, but they chose Mitt Romney.
Oh, yeah, because they're full of shit is what it tells you.
Yeah, and not just like, oh, he's a rich guy. I mean, libertarians
appreciate
wealth creation. But, you know, Matt Taibbi did this giant thing all about Bain Capital, where he talked about it like it was Goldman Sachs. It was this incredibly corrupt company, and maybe they stayed within the law, but what they did was absolutely criminal. What they do is they do a hostile takeover of a perfectly good company. They would drive it into severe debt, and then they would just liquidate everything and run and leave the debt to the previous stockholders to pay off or the previous leadership to go, and they just steal all the money. And then they just did that over and over again. That was what happened at KB Toys. Remember them from the mall in the 1980s and whatever? That was like the most famous example. And it was this company that had been created by this toy maker who it was the absolute love and passion of his entire life to build this company and all this. And then this is what happened to it. It was Mitt Romney and these parasites came. They never, Bain Capital never invested, or in at least according to the Taibbi thing, their specialty was never investing in a company and building it up and making it a successful company. They were purely parasites and vultures who would come in, even take a good company and leverage all the debt against it, take all the money, and then leave the husk for somebody else to deal with. And he did that. And that was how he made his entire fortune. And then, sorry, the point. And the Satan-worshipping Republican Party decided that that was who they wanted to be their nominee because they didn't see what was wrong with it. They thought it was great. This guy who during the campaign, he had 5 sons, all of whom were fighting age, none of whom had spent one day in the army, while their father's one of the worst hawks in the country. Where he talked about, I had to tear down my mansion in L.A. Was it in L.A. or in one of the beach cities south of L.A.? I had to tear down my mansion and build a new mansion on the same spot because the car elevator wasn't big enough. So I needed a bigger, better car elevator for my classic car collection. And so I had to tear down the whole mansion and rebuild it. While people, and this is an aftermath of the financial crisis in 2012. And the Republicans are like, yeah, this is our avatar, all right. This is who we believe in. This is what we're all about. And told Ron Paul for the second time in a row to go to hell, old man. What do you know about everything in the world and the Constitution and freedom and economics and history and everything?
Well, I remember specifically Ben Shapiro coming out. It was like the first Republican primary debate. And Ron Paul, of course, the Fed is his thing. He knows the printing the money. Obviously, we were in the middle of quantitative easing and rock bottom zero interest for, for on endless quarters. And you can go back, you can see these Shapiro tweets to this day. They're up. Oh, Ron Paul's up. He's going to scream Jews, and he's a Joos. And so they're just smearing him as an anti-Semite right off the bat. I remember seeing that, and I wasn't like tuned into all of this stuff at the time. I knew a little bit about Zionism and whatnot. I didn't realize it. I did not understand the control that the Israeli lobby had over the American government at that time in my life. And so I remember thinking, what a stupid, stupid comment. Now I see just how evil and strategic it really was, right? And so, yeah.
That guy became somehow, through the algorithm, obviously the Israeli government rigged the algorithm to make Ben Shapiro the leader of the American conservative movement. I mean, how could any man on the right, I don't know about you women exactly, but how could any man on the right respect themselves and be part of a political movement led by that, first of all, tiny, pathetic little boy, and secondly, blatant foreign agent? I mean,
yeah. I remember he talks a little too fast for me and he's a little too smug. He used to make some good points, and I thought he was slightly entertaining when he first came out. He would go to the college campuses and he'd get into it. And of course, a couple years in, I realized, because he's about a year older than me, that actually, all right, it was maybe a little funny when you were like 26, 27 beating up on college kids. Now that you're 35 beating up on college kids, it's weird. Actually, you
can tell it's all just an Israeli plot to try to take over the anti-woke movement.
Right.
There's going to be a new anti-woke right. We have to make sure that Zionists are the leaders of it all. So libs and TikTok and all those things are all run by Zionists.
Of course.
Of course.
Is to try to conflate support for Israel with opposition to all the rest of this craziness. Yeah. And it's so blatant what they're doing. I couldn't find it, but I found the footnote again. It was the Al Jazeera documentary. They did this incredible documentary a few years ago.
The lobby?
The Israel lobby, yeah.
Yep.
And in Britain and in the United States. And they had a section on there about this Facebook page. Oh, and you can read about this at WRMEA, the Washington Report on Middle East Affairs, if you want to look this up. And you can find the video as well. What it is there's a Facebook page, and there's a million of them like this, but this is just the one great example. It was called Kittens and Donuts. And what it is it's this happy, chipper, up-tempo housewife posting pictures of cute little kittens and donuts. And then every 6 weeks or so, they say, stand with Israel. They support women's rights or whatever. And they post a picture of a pink F-16. And then kittens and donuts, kittens and donuts, kittens and donuts, kittens and donuts. And then every 6 weeks or so, stand with Israel. We love Israel so much. And the point being to make it feel like just everybody supports Israel. It's the social psychology, right? That like wherever you go, even on my local Kittens and Donuts page, everybody loves Israel.
Yeah.
It was the Israelis created that Kittens and Donuts page just to do that to you. Just to make housewives, defenseless housewives who love nothing more than looking at cute little kittens say, oh, well, I guess there's this strong correlation between liking kittens and liking Israel somehow.
That's the video that Jordan Sachel is in,
That's
right?
What I was gonna say.
Where he's on and he's explaining how that works. As soon as you said, every 6 weeks or so, they'll just slip this in. So Jordan Sachel, for people, he writes The Dossier, which has a huge following on Substack. And he was caught on hidden camera for this documentary for Al Jazeera, basically admitting, not basically, he does admit that he is a foreign agent for the state of Israel. And this is how he, in his capacity, working for whatever agency he was working for at the time, this is what they do to control the narrative around Israel. And they specifically target stay-at-home American moms, probably moms like me, white women in their 30s. And because, you know, we're kind of the backbone, right? And it's, of course, it's white Christian women. You know, that's where
Ben Shapiro is.
Yeah.
Ben Shapiro is kittens and donuts.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hey, look, girls don't have a penis. That's not how this works. Support Israel.
Yeah.
Grown men shouldn't be in sports competing against young women. That's not fair. Support Israel.
But also, Israel's making all those hormones that they're taking.
Yeah, well, whatever.
But we're not
Support
supposed to.
Israel. Yeah. And so that's the whole thing is, in other words, Ben Shapiro is not actually a human man. And I don't mean that in the sense like, oh, you know, he's subhuman.
Right,
but I just mean
right.
that he is a public relations creation. He's not a human being. He's a commercial, right? He's a product, a Hasbara psyop. If you agree in principle that we should have, I don't know, modesty in our customs and we should have somewhat free markets and capitalism and patriotism. Well, of course you have to support the Likud murdering babies and stealing their property.
Right.
That's all the same thing. Get it? Kittens and donuts and support for Israel. It's all one big deal. And then, but that's the whole point of Ben Shapiro. And by the way, there's this reporter named Darren Beatty from Revolver News.
Yes.
And there's a great interview that he did with Glenn Greenwald on the System Update, where they're picking on Lex Friedman, who's another one just like Ben Shapiro, who, and this is the subject of their interview, was how there is an absolute deliberate plot to push this Friedman guy to the top of every algorithm. He's the most boring interviewer in world history, and yet somehow he is the most sought after of all podcasters, and it's clearly a rigged game. Clearly, the algorithm is pushing him to the front. And then in part of that same interview, Beatty says, I don't have the goods on Friedman, but I do have the goods on Ben Shapiro. And then he quotes from the Google lady, the YouTube lady, saying, oh, you see, because she's being attacked by liberals, saying, oh, man, Ben Shapiro is the alt-right, and he's so extreme, and how come you support him so much? And she says, no, you don't understand. Ben Shapiro is essentially, this is my words, but close. He's a psyop against people who are interested in alternative politics. And what happens is when people go on YouTube and they start looking up alternative, especially right-wing politics, then the algorithm feeds them a bunch of Ben Shapiro to bring them back onto the reservation.
Wow.
To keep them safe and to keep them, they feel like, ooh, I'm being edgy and disobedient because I'm looking at this guy who supposedly is one click to the right of acceptable. And yet what do you really got? Tel Aviv politics, right? What you really got is, kept, sheepdogged back onto the plantation, just the same way that the leftists do to the progressive voters when it's Democrat election time, right? They send Bernie Sanders out to make sure everybody votes for Hillary Clinton. This kind of thing,
right?
And so that's what Ben Shapiro is. He's Clinton. He's kittens and donuts for the Republican Party. He's.
I
Bernie
noticed
Sanders,
there
the
was
sheepdog.
this. Yeah, there was this weird thing. I kind of got a large Twitter following because I was sort of on the left, although I'm more of a libertarian. But I dissented on COVID lockdowns and a lot of the censorship around COVID, and took some cases to court over that. And then the group that I befriended during the COVID era, all were like crazy Zionists. So after when October 7th happened, I just completely fell out with everybody. And I was surprised, it was like a very large percentage. And these were people who prided themselves on being able to see through propaganda and stuff like that on COVID and the vaccines. And they just completely hook, line, and sinker, all of them, on Israel with October 7th. So there was something about that crew, and I think a lot of this is the propaganda that you're talking about came into play there, where they just associated anti-wokeism with Israel, and so Yep,
it happens every time too. In the 1990s, all the right wingers pretended to be anti-government. Until it
Yeah.
turns out that at the end, no, they just didn't like Bill Clinton. And now that
Yeah.
the Republicans are here, they never loved government more. In fact, they never loved anything more than they loved the U.S. government under George W. Bush.
Yeah.
Even though it's not like he was
Yeah.
Ronald Reagan's son, he was George Bush's son. And still,
Right.
they all gave them their sons to get killed for Israel.
Right. Well,
Harvard Daddy, they loved it.
I know, but having been a Republican my whole life and raised in a household of Republicans who, my parents are definitely stereotypical Republicans in a lot of ways. Although they do listen to me and they follow me and they like my stuff. So God bless them for that. Because I know that I just sometimes make them wonder where they went wrong. No, so I've been around Republicans my entire life, and of course the Reagan years were the good old days that everyone thinks on to this day. Reagan was the chosen one, the perfect one, and it's in many ways I feel like they're just always kind of chasing that back again, And with Trump, they get it a little bit. Obviously, Trump is not nearly as spoken as Reagan. But he does invoke a lot of the same feelings, patriotism, love of country, and things like that, and a willingness to say it like it is, right? And no, but I feel like they're always in search of those Reagan years, and nobody's been honest with them that that's never going to happen again because this is a totally different country. And unfortunately, a lot of Reagan's policies contributed to exactly where we are now, and you're never going to get that back. So
yeah, look, and there's really nothing like him. Donald Trump is the closest thing to it. And quite frankly, I think he represents more of a break with the establishment than Ronald Reagan ever did.
Yeah. Definitely. I mean, without a doubt.
Goes so far.
I was more than happy to give him a chance. He's gravely disappointed me with Gaza, and then the free speech stuff just drives me absolutely insane. I'm a First Amendment lawyer, so it drives me the stuff they're doing around throwing people in ICE detention for writing op-eds against Israel. It's the most un-American thing I can imagine. But I have to jump off.
Yes. Thank you so much, Scott.
Thank you so much for joining us. It was amazing to get all your insights. And
I know.
We really appreciate you taking the time. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to do it. And
Yes.
by the way, please send your mailing addresses to Connor, and I'll get you guys copies of the new book.
Yay.
We'll do that.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Thanks.
Okay, cool. Thanks, guys.
Okay.
Have a great night.
Bye.
You too.
Bye.